even though they had 22 attempts last night. Red Auerbach, longtime, Celtics owner and coach, he was not a fan of the 3-point shot with good reason, per your book as well. Do you think the 3-point shot has helped or has it hurt the game of basketball?
Man, I mean, it helped in the sense that it's certainly fun to watch, like it's a great new element. I mean, the problem is, and the way it's kind of broken the game, and I'm not sure if you can fix it or how you fix it, is like you just can't guard that much space. It's
No.
impossible. So it's like, if you have guys who can shoot from 30, 35 feet out and everyone kind of has a green light, even 25 feet, like you can't guard 25 feet out all the way to the basket all the time. It's impossible. So you're going to have these high scoring games. I think what kind of amazes me looking back, especially, is like, man, even someone like Auerbach, like, how did you not see that, like, you could have a guy take one step back or two steps back and get an extra point per shot and not do that all the time? Like,
Right.
and this went until relatively recently. Like, I was looking the other day at like Ray Allen's numbers, and like he was kind of an outlier for his era. Like from the late 90s, early 2000s, when the scoring was real low. But it's
Right.
like,
Him and Michael Redd. Yeah.
but it's
Same
like,
kind
man,
of thing.
how is Ray Allen not your number one option? Like he basically wasn't really a number one scoring option on any team he was on, except maybe Seattle, and Seattle didn't do very well because they didn't have anybody else except
Right.
young Richard. But it's like if you look at the way Ray played, and if you were putting him on like the Heat or the Celtics now,
oh my
you would
gosh,
you would build it around him. You
would.
wouldn't be feeding Paul Pierce. I love Paul Pierce. I love that he's a Hall of Famer. Like I love talking to Paul when he was in the league. Like, but you would get Ray the ball first.
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
I'd want
Yeah.
Ray Allen shooting 12 threes a game instead
Coming
of like
off a screen.
6.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but it's interesting too because like you can kind of see how the three can kind of transform a guy's career, right? So like the number one thing that pops out at me is like, okay, so when Jason Kidd went to the Mavericks and
Mhm.
he wasn't going to be obviously it was Dirk's team, but then it's when he learned a 3-point shot, like that changed almost everything because
Yep.
then you had him, you
Yep.
had Jet Terry, and then you had Dirk on the low block like that. So you have the transformation stories of a guy who was able to adjust and like get another 5-6 years off of his career. But then the downside is that the teams that can't shoot still do. And then it just
Right.
ends up just
Right.
being a brick fest, and it's like this isn't fun. But this is pickup basketball.
But I mean that, right.
not fun.
It's like college, right? At this point, but like obviously playing it at a higher level where it's like it's either 3, a dunk, or that's it, pretty much.
Yeah.
Like there's not a lot in between. And the thing, I think the death of the mid range or whatever is definitely a little overstated, because I think like if you are a great mid range player and like someone like a Kevin Durant, like where they just can't stop you if you pull up, like he's still feasting on that. You still have guys who are taking those shots. I just think like if you're a fringe guy, especially, literally the best things you could do for your NBA career is like move the ball, defend, at least try to defend. Like you don't even have to be a great defender, but put in the effort. And like when no one's checking you, just get behind the 3-point line.
Yeah.
And if
Yeah.
you can
Find a corner.
if you
That's
can
it.
hit an open 3, like you can play in the NBA for 10 years.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I do think
You
it's
really
funny that Charles Barkley like always harps on like going into the post when like dude was one of the worst offenders at being like a 28% 3-point shooter who
Yeah.
kept taking threes.
You're
Like
so
Charles,
bad.
if anyone should have gotten in the post all the time, it was you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
100%.
So Russ, I really enjoyed your book because I loved how you grouped in the different players with their shoe, with their brand, associated, and obviously the era that came with it. That being said, my favorites are obviously Kobe's and Nike's, T-Max, Adidas, Iverson's and Reebok, Jordan and Jordan brand, obviously. But what's your favorite brand, shoe, and era combination?
I think And not to piggyback, but I think that Kobe Nike era, like starting with the Kobe 4 when he sort of decided like, okay, we're gonna go low cut and lightweight and make this work. Like I think that was just the perfect combination of player, designer, concept. Um, Obviously the ads were great. You know, the jumping over the jumping over the Aston Martin thing to like, you know, doing all those the ankle insurance, which I believe actually was for one of his earlier ones. Um, I think a lot of guys just wear what they get, or just kind of like, you know, obviously they want to have input, but it's
The
more on a
brand,
superficial level.
right?
But I think Kobe was the one guy who was just so super involved at every level, and like I think understood better than most that like this can give me an advantage. Like, you know, is it going to give me an advantage or probably not? But if you're someone who's literally maximizing every other aspect of your game, like an
Why
extra
not?
gram or something counts. It can
Yeah,
actually help you. Um,
I remember too when they were talking about coming up with like where he was doing like the low cut stuff and just hearing like, really? Like that was just kind of an interesting take on it. But if there's anybody who's going to potentially go against the grain and, like you said, be very meticulous as far as the design and what it was going to do for him, like it makes sense that it was Kobe. But even at the time, it was like, oh, that's interesting. He's going to go low cut because like all of them, you know, I remember having my first. I think the first pair that I ever bought were the Grant Hill ones when he came out
okay,
with
yeah,
Fila,
yeah,
and it was like the super high top, pretty much came past your ankle. It had the black design all the way around it, and then
yep.
it was like, okay, you typically, you know, the high tops and so on and so forth. So it's, and I imagine that everyone kind of looked at Kobe and like, oh, okay, here's the marketing campaign around it. Here's what I have to do. So that kind of enhanced everybody else's like, oh, okay, I'm just going to follow what Kobe did and see, you know, see if I can replicate the same sort of buzz or kind of success around it.
Well, it's funny because like I had bad ankles when I used to play, and like I remember I had a pair of Maestros that in like the mid '90s, and they had like 3 eyelets above the ankle, like they went mad high, and it's just like, all right, I'm gonna lace these up tight and whatever. But it's funny, like, and that's something I didn't realize before researching the book was like, you know, talking to Chris Severn, who was the guy at Adidas who really conceptualized the Superstar, was that, you know, I thought the Pro model was the shoe and the Superstar was just the low cut version of it. And instead, it was the other way around. They built the Superstar as a low cut basketball shoe and made the Pro model the mid cut because they realized like everyone's not going to really want to wear lows. So, like, the idea of a low top basketball shoe was really early on.
right.
And some of that was because like your foot's lower to the ground, the cushioning isn't crazy. So like as long as your foot is stable underneath you, the cut can be low. And I think
Yeah,
like it literally had to come back around to that because, you know, with Nike Air and then like Reebok with that ERS thing, and like they kept making the soles bigger for more cushioning underfoot. And then once you do that, it gets unstable. So it's like,
More
okay, how
weight.
do we
Yeah,
counterbalance this on top?
right.
So I think by the time the Kobe thing happened and Zoom Air obviously, you know, was part of it, where it's like, okay, we can give you enough cushioning and still play low to the ground so we can take off the top. But I think it did take someone like Kobe, who obviously grew up in Italy, you know, playing soccer and whatever else, like realizing like, wait, people cut all the time wearing low tops and their ankles don't die. Like, why can't this work in basketball?
sure.
Right. And Russ, before we let you go, so there is a topic that we're going to discuss on this podcast. So we want to have your opinion. Obviously, the NBA committee, competition committee, is going to have a sit down soon, you know, to talk about how to balance the game, right? And I guess what in your eyes does that entail? Like, what are they going to be looking at, and how can they fix things?
Oh my God. That's a good question. We need a whole other night for that. Honestly, like one thing, and like I think this isn't just an NBA problem, like this is through all sports, but they need to fix officiating. They need to figure out what officiating is for and how they're going to do it. Like to me, like if you have a game and then like the ball goes out of bounds and it's one of those things where it's like two guys are really close to it, and then they spend the next 5 minutes, in a game where there's like 12 seconds left, staring at a video monitor, trying to figure out from every angle, like, okay, which way, we have to get this right. Yo, like, this isn't a death penalty case. Make the call and play the game. Like, are you going to get stuff wrong occasionally? Sure. They still get stuff wrong anyway.
Yeah, the last 2-minute report is absolutely ridiculous, and the flow of the game's terrible too.
Well, that Knicks game the other night with the Pistons, where they like ran somebody over and there was no call, that balances out that ridiculous call on Jalen Brunson when he got called for a foul on a closeout on like a half-court shot at the end of a tie game, and they ended up losing.
Right.
I think it's just a matter of like figure out what officiating is supposed to do. And to me, it's like the game is played by people, it's called by people, it's not going to be perfect. Get over it. And if you can't make the call based on one viewing, then the call on the floor stands. Just play the game. I don't think anyone's tuning in to watch the refs.
Do you think, though, that because of now the kind of sports gambling floodgates have now been opened, and a lot of more money is being kind of on the line for all of these games, whether they're prop bets, whether they're over-unders, whether they're spreads or teases or what have you. Do you think that we have to get it right is a byproduct of that, because now there's a lot of advertising, as far as on telecasts or sponsorships from these gambling? Right. Do you think that there's any sort of that the have to get it right is kind of a byproduct of that? Or do you think that there's a way to kind of balance it out? Because I agree, because like the last 2 minutes of a game, because the joke always is like before the playoffs, watch the last 5 minutes of the game. You'll kind of get it from that point on. But now the last 5 minutes are like 45 minutes in real time, and then it just ends up being a slog to watch. So do you think that the exact have to get it right is a byproduct of the gambling, or do you think that was kind of on the league's mind before kind of all of the sports gambling took place?
I feel like it was heading that way anyway. I look at like VAR and soccer, and like that's a mess, where it's like, oh my god, this guy was a quarter of an inch offside, so that doesn't count.
Or like the offsides in hockey now too, where like all the goals are,
it's just... Do they get a competitive advantage? No, let it go. Or like the NFL, where they still don't know what a catch is. And like this whole idea of like, does he have control, and like he hits the ground and maybe the ball shifted a little bit, so is that... And it's like, if you go back through like the whole history of the sport, you would invalidate like half the catches. You'd invalidate like half the great plays that people remember. So it's like, what do you want? Like, at some point, I think like you have to recognize that sports first and foremost should be considered entertainment. Like, unfortunately, there are a ton of blowouts too. So like, if you have stuff happening in a blowout, that obviously doesn't even affect any sort of the gambling aspect of things.
Sure.
I guess the other thing like that's quasi related to that, I would like to see them revisit the whole like closing out on a 3-point shooter foul and like infringing on the space. It's like you had one play where, unfortunately Kawhi Leonard got injured. It probably turned that whole playoff series, and now as a result of that, I have to watch James Harden like get an and one on every single 3-pointer.
Every single one.
Just out there, he's out there foul hunting. And like, I just don't get like, okay, so how do you guard the perimeter? Like, you almost can't.
You really can't. You really can't.
You got to...
Or like the leg outs on the 3-point shot, and like, the guy's going to go by you, but you swing the leg out and then you do the pirouette, and it's just like, that's not... Like, if you stick your own leg out and you get hurt, like, that's on you.
I mean, that's Reggie Miller's fault. Reggie Miller invented that, I feel like, in the 90s.
He really did.
Or in the 80s. But, I don't know. Like, you come up with a rule like that, and you determine it to be some hard and fast rule, and it's just like, people are just going to cheat off it, basically, or like, try and get calls off of it. And like, again, is that what people really want to watch out here? Like, I don't know.
No.
Yeah.
But Russ, I totally agree, and I hope it gets better. I think we all hope it gets better. So please go check out Russ's book, The History of Basketball in 15 Sneakers. I promise you will not regret it. It's by far one of my favorite books I've ever read. Props to you, Russ, for writing this.
Appreciate
it. It comes full circle, and I really appreciate you hopping on here and talking to us and chatting up the NBA in your book as well.
Anytime. Really appreciate it, guys.
Thanks, Russ.
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it.
Yep.